The worst choice any man could make. Bernard Holt said it loud enough for the entire room to hear, loud enough for Eliza Monroe to hear. She stood 10 feet away, back straight, hands still, while Red Hollow's finest laughed into their glasses and agreed without bothering to lower their voices. Nobody defended her. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. Eliza didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction of a single trembling breath. Then the doors opened, and Thomas Walker, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, walked straight past every beautiful woman in that room and stopped in front of her. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, stay until the very end. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way through, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far Eliza's story travels. The night it all began, Eliza Monroe was not supposed to matter. That was the cruelest part of it. Not that people disliked her, but that they had simply decided she was irrelevant. A woman who existed at the edges of every important conversation, useful enough to greet at the supply store, forgettable enough to exclude from every dinner table that mattered. In Red Hollow, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882, a woman's value was measured by one thing above everything else, and it had nothing to do with intelligence, honesty, or the quiet kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It was measured by who chose her, and nobody had chosen Eliza Monroe. She was 26 years old, which in Red Hollow already carried a particular kind of shame. Women her age who remained unmarried were discussed in hushed tones at church, pitied at market days, and occasionally subjected to the well-meaning cruelty of older women who offered advice she hadn't asked for. You smile too little, dear. You speak your mind too quickly. Men don't want to feel corrected, Eliza. They want to feel admired. Eliza had heard every version of the same speech. She nodded through all of them. She never changed. Her father, Harold Monroe, ran a small supply store on the main stretch of Red Hollow's only proper street. He was a decent man, worn thin by years and a mild heart condition that had started troubling him the previous winter. Eliza managed the accounts. She had done so since she was 17, first sitting beside her father at the ledger table and then gradually taking it over entirely when his eyesight began to fail. She could spot an arithmetic error in under a minute. She could tell within $3 whether a monthly order was off. She had once caught a discrepancy in the town bank's ledger during a public transaction, caught it said so plainly, and watched the banker's face turn 3 separate colors in rapid succession. That story still circulated, not as a compliment. Too sharp for her own good, was the common verdict. Who wants a wife who makes you feel foolish? She was not beautiful in the way Red Hollow valued beauty, which was to say, she was not decorative, not soft in her manner, not inclined to look down and flutter her lashes when a man spoke. She had dark eyes that held steady, a face that showed exactly what she was thinking, if you knew how to read it, and hands that were calloused from years of real work. She dressed plainly, not from poverty, though they were not wealthy, but from practicality. She had no patience for things that served no purpose. These were not qualities Red Hollow appreciated in a woman. They were qualities it feared. The gathering at the Hargrove house happened on the first Friday of October. Margaret Hargrove was celebrating her youngest daughter's engagement to the son of a cattle rancher from the neighboring valley. A joyful occasion by all accounts, and one that required the participation of every family of note in Red Hollow. The Monroes were not a family of note, but Harold Monroe supplied half the town with dry goods and feed, so an invitation arrived nonetheless. Harold's health was poor that evening. Eliza went alone. She had not wanted to go. She understood what these events were at their core. They were not celebrations so much as demonstrations. Who stood with whom? Who spoke to whom? Who was seen and who was visible only as a body filling the corner of a room? She had attended enough of them to know exactly where she would end up and how the evening would feel by its end. But her father had looked at her with that particular expression. He had the one that said he worried about her without wanting to say it aloud, and she had put on her best dress and gone. The Hargrove house was the largest in Red Hollow, which was saying something only by local standards. It had a wide front room that served as a gathering space when the furniture was pushed aside, and on evenings like this, It filled quickly with ranchers, merchants, and their wives, all dressed in their better clothes and performing the careful social choreography of a small town that took itself seriously. Eliza arrived and immediately understood she had made an error in coming. Ruth Calloway saw her first. Ruth was the wife of Red Hollow's most prosperous cattle dealer, a woman who wore her social position the way a general wears rank, visibly deliberately, and with the expectation that everyone around her would observe it. She stood with a small cluster of women near the center of the room, and when she spotted Eliza, something shifted in her expression. Not hostility exactly. Something worse than hostility. Amusement. "Eliza Monroe," Ruth said in the particular tone that uses a person's name as a verdict. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "My father sends his regrets," Eliza said. "He wasn't well enough to attend." "Of course." Ruth smiled at the women around her, and the smile carried an entire conversation that excluded Eliza completely. "Well, it's good you came. A woman your age should get out as much as possible. One never knows." One of the other women. Catherine Briggs pressed her lips together to suppress a smile. "I heard the Marshall boy is still unattached," she offered in the same generous tone used to offer a lame horse to someone who needs to travel far. "The Marshall boy is 19, Eliza said. "Beggars," Ruth said lightly, and didn't finish the sentence. The women laughed. It was a soft laugh, social, and practiced the kind that could be denied afterward if necessary. Eliza felt it land on her like something physical. She kept her expression still. She had learned over years to keep her expression very still in moments like this. "Excuse me," she said, and moved away before any of them could see what the stillness was costing her. She found a position near the far wall beside a table of refreshments she had no interest in, and spent the next half hour doing what she did in all such situations, watching. She was exceptionally good at watching. She could read a room the way she read a ledger, finding patterns, inconsistencies, the places where the numbers didn't quite add up. What she saw watching read. Hollow's finest gathered to celebrate Margaret Hargrove's daughter was a town that had organized itself into a very specific hierarchy and was deeply committed to maintaining it. The ranching families clustered together. The merchant families occupied their own orbits. The younger women moved carefully through the space, aware of being evaluated. The older women did the evaluating. The men talked business in the language of cattle prices and land value, occasionally drifting toward one group of women or another, like ships checking their bearings. Nobody drifted toward Eliza. She had accepted this. That was what she told herself with the firmness of someone who has made peace with something by choosing not to examine it too closely. She had accepted that she occupied a particular place in this community, and that the place was useful, but not valued, necessary, but not sought. She had her work. She had her father. She had the satisfaction of knowing her own worth, even when no one around her appeared to share that assessment. She had told herself this so many times, it had begun to feel like truth. And then Bernard Holt opened his mouth. Bernard Holt was a man who had made his money in real estate transactions that the more charitable members of Red Hollow described as aggressive, and the less charitable described with language not fit for print. He was loud in the way that men who mistake volume for authority often are, and he had over the years appointed himself as a kind of informal authority on the subject of social standing in Red Hollow. He knew who mattered and who didn't. He was pleased to tell anyone who asked, and many who didn't. How was standing with a group of men near the center of the room when Eliza became aware that his voice had risen enough to carry. She wasn't trying to listen. She was simply present, and Bernard Holt was simply loud. "Worst choice a man could make," he was saying with the casual confidence of someone who doesn't worry about being overheard because he doesn't consider the subject worth protecting. "She's got no family money, no connections, and she'd spend every dinner correcting your arithmetic. What man wants that?" One of the other men said something she couldn't hear. Holt laughed. "Oh, she's not unpleasant to look at, I'll give her that. But pleasant to look at doesn't keep a ranch running, and it doesn't give a man peace in his own house. I'd sooner hire her at the store than introduce her to my sons." He paused for the laugh he expected, and received it. Though I don't suppose she'd turn down either offer at this point. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. The room hadn't stopped. Conversations continued around her. Margaret Hargrove laughed somewhere across the space. Glass clinked. Boots shuffled on the wooden floor. But inside Eliza's chest, something had gone very quiet and very cold. She became aware slowly that she was not the only one who had heard. Ruth Calloway had heard. Catherine Briggs had heard. Several of the younger women had heard, and they were doing the careful studied thing of appearing not to have heard, while making absolutely certain to remember every word. The information would be currency tomorrow. It would be repeated over coffee and sewing circles, and at the back of the dry goods counter when they thought Eliza wasn't listening. She had two choices. She could leave, walk out quietly, and allow the room to understand that she had been wounded, and allow Bernard Holt to have said something true enough to make her flee. Or she could stay and be still, and refuse to give the room the satisfaction of watching her break. She stayed. She pressed her back against the wall, and she kept her hands loose at her sides, and she breathed with a deliberateness that looked to anyone watching like perfect calm. Inside, she was doing what she always did in moments that threatened to undo her. She was recounting facts. Facts were reliable. Facts did not shift or wound or turn on you without warning. Fact, she was 26 years old and unmarried, and that was the entirety of what Bernard Holt knew about her. Fact, Bernard Holt had 2 years ago submitted accounts to the county assessor that Eliza had noticed were underreported by a sum significant enough to matter. She had said nothing because it was none of her business, and no one had asked her. But she knew. Fact, the value of a thing does not change because someone fails to recognize it. She had said that once to her father when he worried aloud about her future. He had looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "That's a brave way to live, Eliza. I hope the world earns it." She was still standing at the wall, all very still, very composed, when the front doors of the Hargrove house opened. She noticed it because the room changed. Not dramatically, it wasn't the kind of entrance that silenced conversation or turned every head simultaneously. It was subtler than that, the way a current shifts in water. People became aware. Conversations paused mid-sentence, and then resumed on altered trajectories. Ruth Calloway straightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret Hargrove began moving toward the door with the practiced urgency of a hostess who has just realized something important has arrived. Thomas Walker did not enter a room the way most men did. He didn't make a performance of it. He simply walked through the door, and the room reorganized itself around him. The way water moves around a stone, not because he demanded it, but because the room understood instinctively that something significant had arrived. Eliza had seen Thomas Walker at a distance. Everyone in Red Hollow had seen Thomas Walker at a distance. He owned the largest ranch within 3 counties, a spread of land so extensive that to ride its full boundary required most of a day on a fast horse. He employed a workforce of 40 men. He had survived 2 range wars, a drought that had driven lesser ranchers out of the territory, and a legal dispute over water rights that had lasted 4 years and ended precisely as he'd intended it to. He was 41 years old, which in Red Hollow was the age at which a successful man was considered settled, and a woman of similar age was considered past it. He had been married once years ago, and his wife had died and he had not remarried, and the town had spent years speculating about why. I was not what she had expected, standing close enough now to observe rather than merely see. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried in his movements, with a face that had been weathered by years outdoors into something that couldn't be called handsome exactly, but was arresting the kind of face that showed its history without apology. He dressed well, but without vanity. There was nothing in his manner of the performance she associated with wealthy men, the careful display of their own importance. He looked instead like a man who was accustomed to his importance and had long since stopped needing to demonstrate it. He scanned the room with the efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly, and his gaze stopped on Eliza. She didn't look away. She was too surprised to look away, and then the moment for looking away had passed, and so she simply held his gaze across the width of the room and waited to see what he would do with it. He moved toward her. Margaret Hargrove intercepted him halfway across the room, reaching for his arm with a smile that contained genuine warmth and calculated opportunity in roughly equal measure. "Mr. Walker, I'm so glad you could come. I know you don't often attend these." "I heard," he said, not unkindly, but with the brevity of a man who doesn't have much patience for social preface. "Congratulations to your daughter. I hope she and young Perkins do well." He said it with what appeared to be genuine courtesy, shook Margaret's hand, and then continued across the room. He stopped in front of Eliza. She was aware in the peripheral way of someone trying very hard not to look around that the room had noticed. Ruth Calloway was watching. Bernard Holt had fallen silent mid-sentence. Several younger women had turned in ways they imagined were subtle. "You're Harold Monroe's daughter," Thomas Walker said. It was not a question. "I am," Eliza said. "You caught a mistake in Calloway's bank submission 2 years ago, in front of about 30 people. "I corrected an arithmetic error," Eliza said. "The setting was incidental." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the precursor to one. "I've been told you manage your father's accounts." "I have managed them for 9 years. He studied her for a moment with the directness of someone who has spent a long time learning to read people quickly and has little patience for the versions of themselves people present when they want something. "I'm told you're honest." "I try to be." "People usually say that as a courtesy," he said. "What I mean is, I'm told you're honest when it costs you something. That's different." She considered him. "What is it you're actually here to ask me, Mr. Walker? Because I don't think it's whether I'm honest." The thing in his expression became a definite smile, brief but real. "No," he said. "It's not." He glanced once around the room, not defensively, simply taking in the audience he'd acquired without appearing to care about it. "I have a problem with my accounts. I've been losing money for 3 years in ways I can't track, and I've had 3 different men look at the books, and none of them have found the source. I was told—" He paused. "I was told, you see things other people miss." "Who told you that?" "Your father," he said. "About 2 years ago. In a conversation I suspect he never mentioned to you." Her father had told Thomas Walker she was worth hiring. 2 years ago, Harold Monroe had said something to the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties that had apparently stayed with the man long enough to bring him to a gathering he clearly hadn't come for. She thought of her father's expression when she'd left the house this evening. The specific look of the man with a plan he wasn't sharing. "What kind of losses?" she said. "Enough to matter," Thomas said. "I'll tell you the full amount when we're not standing in the middle of a room that's trying very hard to look like it's not listening." She glanced past him. He was right. The room was listening with the practiced inattention of people who are very obviously eavesdropping while appearing to be absorbed in other conversations. Ruth Calloway had positioned herself at a slightly better angle. Bernard Holt was watching with an expression that had moved from amusement to something more complicated. "I'm not looking for charity," Eliza said, "or for the appearance of an opportunity that isn't genuine." "I know," Thomas said. "If I wanted charity cases, I'd have asked any of the other women in this room." He said it without cruelty, as a plain statement of fact. "I need someone who can do the work. I've been told that's you. Whether you want the position or not is your decision to make." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the party continued its performance of a party glasses refilled laughter, rising and falling boots on floorboards. Her mind was already moving through what he'd told her, 3 years of losses. 3 men who hadn't found the source. Either the losses were hidden well, or the men who'd looked weren't looking hard enough, or they were looking in a direction someone wanted them to look. All 3 possibilities were interesting. "How soon would you need an answer?" she said. "I was hoping for one tonight," Thomas Walker said. "Then yes," Eliza said. "I'll look at your books." He nodded once. Business concluded for the moment in the way of a man who expected to be taken at his word and returned the courtesy. "Come Monday morning. I'll have everything ready." He left shortly after, not abruptly, not impolitely, simply, efficiently, the way a man leaves a place when he has accomplished the thing he came to accomplish. Margaret Hargrove watched him go with an expression caught between flattery and bafflement. He had attended her gathering, congratulated her daughter, and spent the entirety of his social time talking to Eliza Monroe. The room rearranged itself in his wake. Eliza stood exactly where she had been standing and felt the shift in its temperature. Ruth Calloway came to her within 5 minutes. She didn't disguise the approach. She moved across the room with purpose, which was its own kind of social message, and arrived at Eliza's side with a smile that had been recalculated since the last one. "That was quite an exchange," Ruth said. "He offered me work," Eliza said, "reviewing his ranch accounts." "Is that what it was?" Ruth said it as a statement rather than a question. "Well, that's—" She paused, searching for the register. "Unexpected." "Yes," Eliza agreed pleasantly. "I suspect that's true." Ruth's smile held, but something behind it moved and resettled. She excused herself a few minutes later, and Eliza watched her go, and then looked across the room to where Bernard Holt was standing very still, with a glass in his hand that he wasn't drinking from. She thought with a calm that surprised even herself, "I will remember that I owe you nothing." She went home before the evening was over. She walked the 2 blocks to the house she shared with her father in the cool October dark, and found him still awake at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside him. "How was it?" he said. She sat down across from him. "You told Thomas Walker about me," she said. "2 years ago." I didn't pretend not to know what she meant. Harold Monroe was many things, but he was not a man who wasted energy on performances. He looked at her with the particular steadiness of a father who has made a calculation he believes in. "I told him the truth," he said. "That you were the best with numbers I'd ever seen, and that you had more sense than any of the men he'd likely been relying on." A pause. "I suppose he finally had a reason to listen." "He offered me a position," she said, looking at his accounts. Her father's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled the way a man looks when he's been carrying a worry for a long time and has just been told it may be set down. "And?" "I said yes," Eliza said. He picked up his cold tea, looked at it, and set it down again. "Good," he said. "It's past time someone saw what I see." She went to bed that night and did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about what she was walking into a ranch with 3 years of unexplained losses, 3 failed attempts at investigation, and a man whose reputation for being difficult to deceive had not apparently protected him from being deceived for years. She thought about the way Thomas Walker had looked at her across the room, not with the particular attention men sometimes gave a woman. They were evaluating for other purposes, but with the sharp assessing focus of someone who is looking for competence and is prepared to recognize it wherever it appears. She thought about Bernard Holt saying worst choice a man could make. She thought, we'll see about that. Monday arrived with the particular clarity of a cool October morning, and Eliza walked the distance to the Walker Ranch on foot because her father's horse needed rest, and because she had always thought better while moving. The Walker land began before the house became visible. You could tell where it started by the quality of the fencing, which was maintained with a precision that spoke of either pride or professionalism, or both. The main house came into view and resolved from a shape into a building. Large, solid, practical in its construction. The kind of house built not to impress, but to last. A man named Garrett, who appeared to serve as Thomas Walker's foreman and general deputy in household matters, met her at the door and showed her to a room that had been set up as a workspace. A wide table, the ranch's books stacked in an order that suggested recent organization, 2 oil lamps positioned for good light. It was the action of someone who had expected her to say yes. Thomas Walker appeared 20 minutes after her arrival. He had clearly come from working, which she noted, because it told her something he hadn't stopped his morning to wait for her arrival, which meant he trusted her to get started, or he was making a point about his own schedule, or both. "Find anything yet?" he said, and there was something in his tone that was almost a test, watching to see if she'd been sitting idle or had already begun. She had already begun. "Your beef tallies for the last 2 years don't match your sale records," she said without looking up from the ledger open in front of her. "You're consistently showing about 4% fewer cattle at sale than your previous tallies would predict, even accounting for normal loss. Either you're losing cattle before sale, or someone is recording sales and not recording them fully." He went still. 3 men looked at those books. 3 men who presumably started with the sale records, she said. "I started with the tally records. The error shows from the other direction." She looked up. Who keeps your cattle tallies? He named a man called Sykes, a tallyman he'd hired 6 years ago, recommended by a neighboring rancher. She wrote the name down. Who recommended him? He told her. She wrote that name down too, and she watched Thomas Walker watch her write it, and saw the moment when something in his expression shifted from the careful attention of a man who has been lied to before and moves cautiously to something that was not yet trust, but was the first reaching toward it. 3 years, he said, more to himself than to her. Possibly longer, she said. I'd need to go back further to establish a baseline. Do you have books from before 6 years ago? He did. He retrieved them himself, which she noted he didn't send for a hand or ask Garrett. He went and returned with an older ledger and set it on the table, and she thanked him, and he sat down in the chair across the table, rather than leaving, which she also noted. You're going to stay while I work, she said. I'm going to learn how you work, he said. If that's acceptable. It's your house, she said. It's your investigation, he said. She looked at him for a moment. He had an unnerving quality of directness, of simply saying the thing, rather than the performance of the thing, that she found both comfortable and slightly disorienting because it was unfamiliar. Most people performed their directness. His appeared to be structural. It's both, she said, and turned back to the ledger. They worked in relative silence for most of that morning, broken occasionally by questions from her and answers from him. Specific questions, the kind that require genuine knowledge to answer: who handled the southeast pasture rotation, which buyers they'd sold to in October of 1880, whether the same hands worked the autumn drives each year. He answered them quickly and completely, which told her he knew his operation with genuine intimacy, not the distant overview of a man who lets others manage the details. Around midday, Garrett brought food without being asked. Thomas thanked him with the ease of a man who is comfortable being served without being waited on, which was a distinction Eliza had learned to observe. There was no performance in it, no demonstration of status. Just a man in his own house eating lunch with someone he'd hired to do a job. Why did you really come to the Hargrove party? Eliza asked when they had eaten in a silence that had ceased to be uncomfortable at some point in the preceding hour. He considered the question with the same unhurried directness he brought to everything. Because I'd made a decision, he said, and I wanted to make it before I changed my mind. A decision to hire someone. A decision to stop managing alone, he said. He set down his fork. I've run this ranch for 16 years by trusting very few people and verifying everything I couldn't verify, I didn't stake my future on. That's kept me solvent through things that should have broken me. But something got through anyway. He paused. Either I'm not as good as I thought I was, or someone I trusted knew how I operated and worked around it specifically. She understood what he meant. Both possibilities were troubling. The second was worse. When did you start noticing the losses? She said. 3 years ago, this coming spring, he said. First I thought it was weather. Then I thought it was management. By the time I started thinking it was something else, I'd been looking for the problem in the wrong place for a year. She nodded slowly. The person who hid this, she said carefully, understood your books well enough to hide something in them for 3 years without you finding it. That's not a casual crime. That took planning. I know, he said. And the weight in those 2 words told her he had been sitting with that knowledge alone for longer than he'd admitted to anyone. She turned back to the ledger. She worked until the light began to change, losing track of time in the way she always did when a problem was interesting enough to swallow her attention, and when she finally looked up and saw the angle of the afternoon coming through the window. She realized she had been there for nearly 8 hours. Thomas Walker was still there. He had moved at some point to the far chair and had a different ledger open. He'd been doing his own work in the same room, she realized, as naturally as if they had been sharing a workspace for years. I need to go, she said. My father will be waiting. Of course. He rose. Did you find anything more? Yes, she said. 3 more discrepancies. I'll need 3 more days to trace them properly. He nodded. I'll have Garrett light the stove early so you don't walk into a cold room. It was a practical statement. Nothing more than that. But it was also the consideration of someone who had anticipated her return without assuming it, who had prepared for a possibility rather than taking it as a given. Thank you, she said. She walked home in the early dark, and she was halfway there when she realized that she had spent 8 hours in the company of Thomas Walker and had not at any point during those 8 hours been aware of being evaluated or found wanting or placed in the wrong category. She had simply been a person doing a job, and he had simply been a person in the same room, and the terrible pressure she carried in public, the constant low-level awareness of how she was being measured, had been entirely absent. She thought about that the whole way home. By the third day, she had found the pattern. It was elegant in the way a well-executed deception is always elegant. Not because elegance is admirable in that context, but because it reveals the intelligence behind it, and intelligence even deployed for wrong purposes has a particular shape. Whoever had designed this theft understood cattle ranching at the level of genuine expertise. They understood how Walker operated his tallies, how his sales records were filed, where the natural variation in numbers created enough cover to conceal deliberate manipulation. They had been careful in a way that assumed the books would be reviewed from the direction most likely to be reviewed. They had not anticipated someone reviewing them from the other direction. She was still staring at the pattern. When Thomas Walker came into the workroom that third morning, and she looked up and said without preamble, because she had learned in 3 days that he didn't want preamble from her, "I know where the money went, and I know how it was done. I need another day to establish the full amount, but I want to tell you something first." He sat down. His expression was careful. "Go ahead." "This was designed by someone who knows your operation from the inside," she said. "The way the records are structured, the specific tallying method, the timing of the discrepancies. This isn't someone who got lucky. This is someone who knew exactly how Thomas Walker runs his ranch and built the theft around it." She paused. "That means it's someone you trusted, maybe still trust." Howe was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear one of the hands moving past the window boots on frozen ground. "Sykes," he said. "Sykes is part of it," she said. "But the design is too sophisticated for a tallyman working alone. Someone told him what to do and how to do it." "Someone with financial knowledge." "Yes." Another long silence. She watched his face and saw the particular expression of a man who is arriving at a name and does not want to arrive at it. "Give me the rest of the day," she said. "By tomorrow morning, I'll have everything documented." "Documented how?" he said. "Documented so that a judge would find it legible and convincing," she said. "I learned a long time ago that truth needs to be able to survive being argued with." He looked at her for a moment, that direct assessing look she was becoming accustomed to. Then he said very quietly, "My father once told me that the most valuable person in any situation is not the one who tells you what you want to hear. It's the one who tells you what you need to know when it costs them something to say it." She thought about Bernard Holt. She thought about Ruth Calloway. She thought about the Hargrove party and the particular sound a room makes when it decides someone doesn't matter. "I just do the arithmetic," she said. Thomas Walker shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You don't." She turned back to the ledger and worked until she had everything she needed, and by the time the sun had fully risen the next morning, she had a document that laid out in clear and irrefutable detail how Thomas Walker's ranch had been bled for 3 years, by whom and exactly what the total loss amounted to. She set it on the table in front of him without ceremony. He read it in silence. When he set it down, he looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen before on his face. Something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude and not quite something else, but that lived in the territory between all three. "Eliza," he said. "Yes." "The town thinks I came to that party to find a wife," he said. "I suspected," she said. "I didn't," he said. "I came to find the one person in Red Hollow who still told the truth." He paused. "I think I found her." She looked at the document between them. 3 years of theft laid out in her handwriting, ready to be carried to the county judge. A problem that 3 other men had failed to solve. A truth that had been hidden with considerable sophistication and discovered because she had simply looked at it from a different direction. She thought of her father saying, "It's past time someone saw what I see." She thought of Bernard Holt saying, "Worst choice a man could make." She thought, "Not yet. We are only at the beginning." "What will you do with it?" she said, nodding at the document. Take it to Judge Harlan in the county seat, Thomas said. Press charges. Recover what I can. His voice was steady. He had absorbed the blow of the information and was already thinking forward. And I'll ask you to stay on if you're willing, because I suspect there are other places in these books that haven't been looked at carefully enough. There are, she said. I found 2 other areas that warrant investigation. They may be nothing. They may not be. Then we'll look at them together, he said. She noticed with the clarity of someone who has been standing in the cold for a long time and has just moved into warmth that he had said together. Monday, she said. I'll be here Monday. He nodded. And for just a moment across the table that held 3 years of theft and its complete unraveling. Something passed between them that was not yet defined and did not need to be a recognition quiet and mutual between 2 people who had each spent a long time not being seen and had just without warning been seen. She walked home through the October morning, and the light was coming sideways across the fields, the way October light does when the season is genuinely changing. The town would hear about this. The town heard about everything. Ruth Calloway would have something to say. Bernard Holt would have something to say. Eliza Monroe walked in the October light and thought about a problem solved, a truth documented, and a man who had come to a party not to find what everyone assumed he was looking for. The worst choice, she thought. We will see. The document reached Judge Harlan in the county seat by Wednesday. Thomas Walker had ridden out himself, which surprised people. A man of his standing didn't typically carry his own paperwork across 40 miles of open country. He had hands for that. He had a lawyer on retainer in the county seat who could have arranged the submission with a single letter. But Thomas Walker rode out himself with Eliza's document in his saddlebag and arrived back in Red Hollow by Friday afternoon, and the first thing he did when he returned was stop at Monroe's supply store. Eliza was behind the counter when he came through the door. Her father was in the back, resting, which was happening more frequently now as the autumn chill worked its way into his joints. She looked up from the ledger she was reconciling and said nothing, because she had learned in the past 2 weeks that Thomas Walker didn't require a greeting to feel welcomed. Harlan reviewed it same day, he said without preface. He's issuing a summons for Sykes. The other name on the account, Eliza, it was Caldwell. She set down her pen. Daniel Caldwell. Yes, Daniel Caldwell was not a tallyman. Daniel Caldwell was a man who had for the past 7 years served as a kind of informal financial advisor to several of Red Hollow's larger ranching operations. Not a banker, not a lawyer, but positioned in that useful space between both a man who understood numbers and contracts and who had made himself indispensable to people who were brilliant at running cattle and less brilliant at running accounts. He was well liked. He attended church. His wife organized the Harvest Festival every October. How was at the Hargrove party? Eliza said. He was, Thomas said, standing about 12 feet from me when I talked to you. She absorbed that, the specific quality of it. Daniel Caldwell, standing in the same room, watching Thomas Walker cross the floor toward Eliza Monroe, knowing exactly why the investigation he had carefully constructed to be invisible was about to become visible. What did his face look like? She said. Thomas considered. Like a man watching a fire start that he can't reach to put out. Eliza picked up her pen and set it down again. Her hands wanted something to do with the information. He'll know it was me, she said. He'll know you didn't find this on your own because 3 other men didn't find it, and the only thing that changed was me. Yes, Thomas said. He wasn't pretending otherwise. He watched her steadily. I want to know if that concerns you. It concerns me that he's had a week to prepare, she said. What concerns me more is whether he had partners we haven't identified. The account structures I found Caldwell was the architect, but the execution required access. I'm not sure he had a loan. Someone moved cattle between the documentation cycles. That's not a man who sits in an office with a pen. That's someone on the ground. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Sykes moved the cattle. Sykes followed instructions, Eliza said. Who gave Sykes his instructions when Caldwell wasn't on your land? Caldwell visited your ranch, what, quarterly? Someone had to manage the day-to-day coordination. She paused. Who on your crew has been with you longer than 6 years? He named 4 men. She wrote them down. Not because she believed they were all guilty, she didn't, but because she had learned that in a theft designed with this much care, the innocent details and the guilty details looked identical until you found the thread that separated them. "I'll need to look at the employment records," she said. He nodded. "Monday," he said. Then, "Eliza." He waited until she looked up. "Be careful between now and Monday." It was the first time he had said anything that existed outside the boundary of professional transaction, and it landed with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Not the warning itself, but the manner of it, direct, unadorned, the words of a man who said exactly what he meant, and nothing extra. "I'm always careful," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to be more careful than usual." She looked at him for a long moment across the counter of her father's store, with a ledger between them, and the smell of dried goods and sawdust around them, and the sounds of Red Hollow going about its Friday afternoon outside the window. "All right," she said. He left, and she stood behind the counter for a full minute after he was gone, completely still, before she picked up her pen and went back to the numbers. The town's awareness of what was happening had begun building before the summons was formally issued, because in Red Hollow information moved. The way water moved in a drought. It found every crack and ran through it, and nothing stayed contained for long. By Saturday morning, there were 2 distinct versions of events circulating through the community, and they were spreading with the particular velocity of stories that carry within them a disruption to the social order. The first version was essentially accurate. Thomas Walker had hired Eliza Monroe to investigate financial irregularities in his ranch accounts. She had found evidence of serious theft, and the matter was now before the county judge. This version was told by people who found it interesting and were willing to let facts be facts. The second version was considerably more creative. Eliza Monroe had somehow manipulated a wealthy and recently vulnerable man into giving her access to his personal finances, and whatever she had found in those books was manufactured to serve her own purposes, the nature of which remained deliciously unspecified, but was universally understood to be mercenary. This version was told by people who found the first version inconvenient for reasons they didn't examine too carefully. Ruth Calloway told the second version to anyone who would listen. She was not alone. Eliza heard both versions before Sunday. She heard the first from old Tom Briggs, Catherine's father-in-law, who stopped her on the street to say gruffly that he was glad someone had finally caught the man, meaning Caldwell, whom he had apparently distrusted for years without specific cause. She heard the second from 3 separate sources she hadn't sought out. It simply found her, the way unpleasant information always does, through the grocery run and the post, and a woman at the dry goods counter who repeated it to someone else without realizing Eliza was 2 feet away and listening. She stood behind the shelving and heard herself described as calculating, desperate, and cunning in the same sentence, and felt the familiar cold stillness move through her chest and waited for it to pass. And when it passed, she felt something else underneath it. Not quite anger. Something harder than anger. A resolve that had found in being tested that it was more solid than she had previously known. Her father found her that evening, sitting at the kitchen table, with the employment records Thomas had sent over via Garrett, a boy of about 14, who arrived on horseback with a saddlebag, and a note that said, simply, "Thought you might want to start before Monday." Harold Monroe sat down across from her without asking what she was doing, because he already knew. He watched her for a moment, and then he said, "They're talking about you." "I'm aware," she said. "It doesn't bother you." It was not quite a question. She looked up. "It bothers me," she said. "I'm choosing not to let it matter." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a difference," he said finally, "between ignoring something and deciding it doesn't own you." "I know," she said. "I'm working on the second one." He patted her hand once the way he had since she was a child, and went to make tea, and she turned back to the employment records. The name she found wasn't one of the 4 Thomas had given her. It was a 5th man, a hand named Roy Deaver, who had been hired not by Thomas directly, but by Sykes, and whose employment had begun approximately 6 years and 3 months ago, which was to say, slightly before the period when the tallying discrepancies began. Deaver worked the East Pasture rotation. He had no official role in the accounting. He appeared in the records only as a name on the payroll, receiving the standard wage, consistent and unremarkable. How was also according to a note in the margin of the original hiring record. A note made in Sykes's handwriting, a man who had come recommended by Daniel Caldwell. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote it down clearly and completely and added it to the document she was building. Monday arrived and she walked to the Walker Ranch in a morning that had turned sharply cold overnight, the kind of cold that didn't argue with you. Thomas was already in the workroom when she arrived, which had become his habit. He was always there before her, not waiting but present. The way a man is present who has somewhere specific he wants to be. She told him about Deaver without sitting down. Stood in the doorway of the workroom with her coat still on and said, "Roy Deaver, East Pasture, hired by Sykes on Caldwell's recommendation 6 years ago." Thomas went still. She had come to recognize not a physical stillness exactly, but a quality of collected attention, everything drawn inward and focused. "Deaver's still on the payroll," he said. "Yes." "He's been moving my cattle." "That would be my conclusion," she said. "We'd need to verify it, but the timing fits and the connection to Caldwell is documented." He stood up. For a moment she thought he was going to do something immediate and physical with the information. Go find Deaver, confront him, the kind of direct action that men of his type tended toward when the patience for careful work ran out. She prepared to tell him why that was a mistake. Instead he said, "Sit down, tell me what we need to do next." She sat down. She told him. He listened with the complete attention he always brought to her working through a problem. Not passive listening, but active asking questions at the right moments, pushing back twice on her logic in ways that forced her to strengthen it. She had discovered a man who understood that being informed was not the same as being led, and who could receive information without needing to immediately perform dominance over it. It was, she thought, rarer than it should be. By mid-morning, they had a plan. Deaver would not be confronted directly, not yet. The evidence against him needed to be airtight before any move was made, because a man who had been careful for 6 years would have contingencies, and the goal was not to startle him into running, but to build a case that left him nowhere to run to. Thomas would quietly reposition the East Pasture rotation over the next 2 weeks, under a legitimate operational excuse, removing Deaver from the specific work where he was most useful to Caldwell's scheme. Eliza would trace back the cattle movement records against the sale documentation to establish a pattern of concrete transactions rather than theoretical discrepancies. "And Caldwell," she said. Thomas's expression shifted. Not anger exactly, something older than anger, the look of a man who has been comprehensively betrayed by someone he trusted and is now in the process of finishing what that betrayal started, rather than beginning to react to it. "Caldwell has a meeting with my lawyer on Thursday," he said. "He doesn't know that I know. He thinks he's coming to discuss a routine land matter. He'll be evaluated during that meeting," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "My lawyer will be asking questions about my overall financial management," Thomas said. "Things Caldwell has advised on. If Caldwell believes he's still trusted, he'll answer those questions a certain way. If he's beginning to suspect, he'll answer them differently." He paused. "Either way, it tells me something." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the night I read your document," he said. She nodded slowly. "That's good strategy." "I've been running a ranch for 16 years, he said with a dryness that was the closest thing to humor she'd heard from him. "Occasionally, I manage to think." She almost smiled. He saw it, she could tell from the slight change in his expression, the way he registered the almost smile and filed it away without making a production of it. They worked through the afternoon. She traced cattle movement records. He reviewed land documents that had a tangential connection to the accounts she was building. The room held the comfortable silence of two people who have found a working rhythm together, where the absence of conversation is not absence of connection. She was deep in a catalog from 1880 when she heard him say without particular prelude, "My wife's name was Clara." She looked up. I was not looking at her. He was looking at the document in front of him, but his attention was clearly not on it. He had the look of a man who has decided to say something and is allowing himself to say it before the decision can reverse itself. "She died of fever," he said. 8 years ago. We'd been married 4 years. A pause. After she died, I decided that running the ranch well was sufficient. That managing the operation properly was a complete enough purpose for a man. He turned a page of the document he wasn't reading. I was wrong about that. But I didn't know I was wrong until someone sat across this table from me and made me realize I'd been talking to myself for 8 years. The room was very quiet. "I'm not telling you this," he said, finally looking up, "because I expect you to do anything with it. I'm telling you because I have told almost no one, and because you are the only person I've been around recently who I trust to hear something true without needing to reshape it." Eliza held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about the Hargrove party and the cold wall and Bernard Holt's voice carrying across a room. She thought about the particular quality of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being consistently misread. "I know what it is," she said carefully, "to have people see only the version of you that's convenient for them to see." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know you do." It was not a resolution. It was not a declaration. It was two people sitting in a workroom with cattle ledgers between them, acknowledging briefly and without drama that they recognized something in each other. Then Eliza turned back to the 1880 catalog, and Thomas turned back to his land documents, and the afternoon continued around them. The summons for Sykes was served on Tuesday. Red Hollow found out about it by Tuesday evening, which was a testament to the speed at which legal information traveled in a small town when it concerned someone known to everyone. Sykes was not a beloved figure. He was a working man, competent in his professional capacity, but not particularly social. But the summons represented the first concrete public evidence that the rumors circulating since the previous week had a legal foundation, and that changed the quality of the conversation. People who had been telling the second version of events, the one in which Eliza was calculating and Caldwell was still respectable, began to reconsider the cost of that version. Daniel Caldwell, for his part, appeared at church on Wednesday with his wife and sat in the same pew he always sat in and spoke to the same people he always spoke to, and only someone who knew what to look for would have noticed anything different about him. Eliza noticed. She was 2 rows back, having attended not from particular religious feeling that morning, but because she understood that visibility was a form of statement, and she intended to make the statement that she was not in hiding. Caldwell's face, when he became aware of her, was extraordinary in its control. He held it perfectly steady, the face of a man who has rehearsed this moment and is executing the rehearsal. But his eyes moved to her and stayed there for approximately 3 seconds longer than the casual glance of a man with nothing to think about, and in those 3 seconds she saw very clearly the fire Thomas had described. Starting. Unreachable. She nodded to him pleasantly and turned away. After the service, standing outside in the cold, Ruth Calloway appeared at her elbow with the precision of someone who has been positioning herself. "I heard about the Sykes summons," Ruth said. Her tone was carefully calibrated, not quite apologetic, not quite conceding, occupying the diplomatic middle ground of a woman who is beginning to recognize she may have miscalculated. "It was filed last Wednesday," Eliza said. "And Caldwell." Ruth paused. "Is it true what they're saying, that Caldwell was involved?" "That's a matter before the county court," Eliza said. "I wouldn't want to speak to it before the judge has reviewed the evidence." Ruth was quiet for a moment. This was clearly not the conversation she had planned. "Eliza," she said with a different quality in her voice, something that was working toward genuine and not quite reaching it. "I want you to know that I never thought you were, that I didn't mean." "Ruth," Eliza said not unkindly, "I know exactly what you thought, and I don't need you to revise it now that circumstances have changed." She paused. "I just need you to let me pass." Ruth stepped aside. Eliza walked through the space she'd created and didn't look back. The Thursday meeting with Caldwell and Thomas's lawyer produced exactly what Thomas had predicted. Caldwell, believing himself still trusted, had answered the financial questions with a specificity that revealed detailed knowledge of account structures he had never officially been granted access to. Thomas's lawyer, a precise man named Fletcher, who had practiced in the county seat for 20 years, had documented every answer. By Thursday evening, Fletcher had sent a writer to Thomas with a note that said, "In the economy of a man who billed by the hour, he knows more than he should. Proceed." Thomas sent a writer to Eliza with the same note. She read it at the kitchen table. Her father asleep in the next room, the lamp throwing a small circle of light across the paper. She sat with it for a moment, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in the growing file of documents. She had been building a file that had begun as a single ledger discrepancy and had grown into a comprehensive record of a 3-year theft, executed with considerable intelligence by a man who had understood correctly that the best place to hide a crime was inside the paperwork of someone who trusted you. She thought about Thomas saying, "I've been talking to myself for 8 years." She thought about the way the room in the Hargrove house had reorganized itself around him when he walked through the door, the social gravity of a man who commanded space without demanding it. And she thought about the fact that inside that authority and that competence, there was a man who had lost his wife at 33 and had responded by deciding that sufficiency was enough, that running things well was a complete life. She thought that is not a complete life, and he knows it now. Friday brought something she hadn't anticipated. She was working in the ranch's workroom. She had been coming every weekday now, which had stopped being remarkable to either of them at some point in the past week, when Garrett came to the door with an expression that managed to be carefully neutral, while also communicating that something requiring attention had occurred. "Man outside asking for Miss Monroe," Garrett said. "Says his name is Bernard Holt." She set down her pen. Thomas, who was at the far table, looked up. The expression he turned toward Garrett was brief, and even the expression of a man confirming information before deciding what to do with it. "Did he say what he wants?" "Says he wants to speak to Miss Monroe privately," Garrett said, with exactly the shade of emphasis that communicated his own assessment of the request. "Says it's a personal matter." Eliza stood up. "I'll speak to him," she said. "Eliza." Thomas's voice was even, not commanding. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "I want to." She met Bernard Holt outside in the cold, which she had chosen deliberately. The cold removed the option of settled comfort and long conversation. It established the terms. This would be brief. Holt looked different from how he had looked at the Hargrove party, slightly smaller, which was not a physical fact, but an impression. The impression of a man whose authority in a situation has shifted since the last encounter. He was dressed well, his face composed, carrying the residue of confidence, even as the situation eroded it. "Miss Monroe," he said. "I'll be direct." "Please," she said. "Caldwell and I have had a business relationship for 4 years," he said. "Land transactions. Nothing connected to Walker's situation. I want to be clear about that. But I've been made aware that the county investigation may look at anyone with financial ties to Caldwell, and I want—" He stopped. Recalibrated. "I want to understand the scope of what you found." She looked at him in the cold morning. Bernard Holt, who had stood in the Hargrove house and called her the worst choice a man could make, was standing in front of her now, asking for information, and the particular quality of what had reversed between them was not lost on either of them. "Mr. Holt," she said, "the investigation concerns Thomas Walker's account specifically. What the county judge chooses to examine beyond those specific accounts is not within my control or my brief." She paused. "If your business relationship with Caldwell was legitimate, a thorough examination will establish that. If it wasn't—" She let the pause do its work. "That's also not within my control." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite respect, but something adjacent to it. The movement of a man who is recalibrating an assessment that he had set in place confidently and is now finding unreliable. "You're not going to help me," he said. "I'm going to do my job," she said, "which has nothing to do with helping or not helping you." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. Was there anything else? There was not. He left, and she watched him go with the steady calm of a woman who has discovered that the people who underestimate you most confidently are the ones who make the least compelling cases when they finally need something. She went back inside. Thomas was at the door of the workroom, which told her he had heard at least the latter part of the exchange because the door had been open. "Holt," he said. "I wanted to know the scope of the investigation," she said. He has financial ties to Caldwell. Land transactions, he says. He's worried. He should be, Thomas said. He studied her. You handled that. Yes, she said. Without... He paused, and something in his expression shifted into the almost smile territory. Without a single unnecessary word. Words have costs, she said. I try to spend them carefully. He stepped aside and she went back to the workroom and picked up her pen. She heard him follow and sit down, and after a moment, the sound of his own work resumed. The week that followed moved with the particular speed of a situation building toward resolution, but not yet there, that compressed urgent quality of time when consequences are accumulating, and the only thing to do is continue the work carefully and trust that careful work is its own protection. The east pasture rotation had been quietly reorganized. Deaver had been repositioned. Caldwell had appeared twice more in town, both times with the maintained composure of a man who had decided that composure was his best remaining defense. And Red Hollow was watching. Not the watching of casual interest. The watching of a community that has realized something important about itself, that it had taken a comprehensive inventory of Eliza Monroe and arrived at a confident valuation, and that the valuation was turning out to be wrong in ways that had implications beyond the individual case. If Eliza Monroe, whom everyone had dismissed as the worst choice, was the one who had found what 3 other men had missed and had built the legal case that was now moving through the county court, then the question of who else in Red Hollow had been dismissed too quickly became an uncomfortable one. Communities don't like uncomfortable questions. They like them even less when the answer involves admitting a specific identifiable error. Ruth Calloway stopped speaking about Eliza in the second version. Catherine Briggs told a friend she had always found Eliza admirable, which was not precisely what she had previously said, but which she delivered with sufficient conviction to be accepted at face value. The conversation shifted the way collective conversations always shift when the evidence becomes too clear to argue with. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of public admission that would require people to say plainly what they'd said and what they'd gotten wrong, but quietly, incrementally, the way a room adjusts its temperature without anyone reaching for the stove. Eliza noticed all of it. She noted it with the same precision she brought to the ledger's recording without judgment, because judgment was expensive and she had better uses for the energy. What she was less prepared for was the evening 2 weeks into November, when Thomas Walker sat across from her in the workroom at the end of a long day and said nothing for long enough that she finally looked up from the document she was working on. Howe was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the assessing look of their early interactions. Not the focused attention of a man managing a crisis. Not even the open, unguarded quality that had emerged gradually as the weeks accumulated. This was something she didn't have a ready category for, a look that was careful and direct. At the same time, the look of a man who is about to say something he has decided to say, and has also decided to say it truthfully. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to answer it honestly, which I know you will, but I'm telling you I want that anyway. She set down her pen. All right. When this is over, he said, when the case is filed and Caldwell is dealt with and the accounts are clean, what do you intend to do? She considered the question for a moment. Go back to my father's store, she said. He needs me there, and I need to work. I know, he said. That's not... He stopped. Started again. I'm asking what you want, not what you'll do, what you want. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, which it did in November in Colorado, in a way that reminded you that winter was not a metaphor, but a physical fact, arriving with genuine intention. I want to do work that matters, she said. I want to do it well enough that the quality of the work is self-evident. I want to... She paused. The honesty he'd asked for required going somewhere she didn't often go in conversation. I want to not have to prove that I deserve to be in the room every time I walk into a room. He was quiet. That's what I want, she said. What I'll get is likely different. It doesn't have to be, he said. She looked at him. I'm not... He seemed for the first time since she'd known him to be choosing words with difficulty, the way a man does when the words available don't quite match the thing being said. I'm not proposing anything. I'm not making assumptions. I'm saying that I have watched you for 2 months do the kind of work that most people in this county couldn't do, and do it with a steadiness that I have not seen in anyone I've worked with in 16 years of running this ranch." He paused. "And I think you deserve to be in whatever room you walk into. And I think I'd like you to keep walking into mine." The wind outside. The lamp between them. Two people who had each spent a long time being confident about what they were not, and considerably less certain about what they were. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "Ask me again," she said, "when the case is closed and the accounts are clean. Ask me when neither of us is in the middle of something." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly with the weight of a man who has said what he came to say and is prepared to wait for what comes next. "Fair enough," he said. She picked up her pen. He picked up his document. The lamp held steady between them, and the work continued, and something else continued alongside it. Quieter, unannounced, without fanfare, the way the most important things always begin. The case against Daniel Caldwell was filed with the county court on the 14th of November. Eliza knew the exact date because she had spent the 3 days prior to it doing something she had never done before in her professional life, reading the same document repeatedly, not to find errors, but to be certain there were none. The record she had assembled was 42 pages of documented transactions, cross-referenced cattle tallies, employment connections, and financial discrepancies traced back across 6 years of deliberate, carefully concealed theft. Fletcher Thomas's lawyer had called it the most organized evidentiary submission he had received from a non-lawyer in 20 years of practice. He had said it with a precision that stopped just short of surprise, and Eliza had accepted the observation without comment. Thomas had ridden to the county seat to file it in person. Again. She had not asked him to. He had simply appeared at the ranch door on the morning of the 14th, told Garrett to hold his afternoon appointments, and gone. He came back that evening with the stamped copy and set it on the table in the workroom without ceremony, the way a man sets down a thing that is finished and does not require further discussion. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. He sat down. He looked for the first time in the weeks she had known him, genuinely tired, not the operational fatigue of a man who works hard, but the deeper exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time, and finally setting it down and discovering in the setting down how heavy it actually was. 6 years, he said. "At minimum," she said. "The baseline I established suggests the pattern may have begun earlier. Fletcher will pursue that through the court process." Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she had not seen from him before, unguarded and entirely human. 6 years, he said again. "I shook that man's hand every time I saw him. I took his advice on 3 land transactions. I trusted him in my own house." She let the silence hold for a moment before she said, "The quality of a betrayal is not a reflection of your judgment. It's a reflection of the sophistication of the deception." He looked up at her. "Caldwell spent 6 years constructing something designed specifically to survive your scrutiny," she said. "He succeeded until someone looked from a different angle. That's not your failure. That's his investment." Thomas held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not resolved because that kind of wound didn't resolve in an evening, but acknowledged, received. "You have a particular way," he said slowly, "of saying the true thing without making it feel like medicine." "Medicine implies you're ill," she said. "You were deceived. That's different." He almost smiled. She was beginning to recognize that almost smile as a specific language the way Thomas Walker communicated things he wasn't yet ready to say directly. The filing did not stay quiet for long. By the following morning, Red Hollow knew. The information moved through the town with the speed of something people had been waiting for. Not exactly anticipated, but not entirely surprising, either the way a storm feels inevitable in the hours before it arrives. Daniel Caldwell was a man woven into the fabric of the community, not at its edges where removal would cause little disruption, but at its center, where his connections ran through half the business relationships in town. His arrest by the county sheriff, which came on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the filing, stopped Red Hollow in a way that even the most dramatic rumors of the previous weeks had not quite managed. Eliza heard about the arrest from Garrett, who arrived at her father's store before she had finished her morning coffee with the expression of a man delivering information he finds significant. She thanked him, finished her coffee, and walked to the ranch. Thomas was already in the workroom. He looked up when she came through the door, and she understood from his face that he already knew. "How are you?" she said, which was not something she had asked him before. The work had provided its own structure for their interactions, and personal inquiry had existed only in the space the work permitted. But this was a different kind of morning. He considered the question as if it deserved genuine consideration rather than a reflexive answer. "Relieved," he said, "and angry, both at the same time." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to take your advice," he said with a dryness that she recognized a specific form of affection. He returned to the document in front of him. "Fletcher says the hearing is scheduled for January. He wants to review the full record again before then. I told him you'd be available to answer questions about the methodology." "I will be," she said. She sat down and opened the file she'd brought with her, the two secondary areas she had flagged weeks ago, the ones that may be nothing and may not be. She had been working through them steadily, building the same kind of careful layered documentation she had built for the primary case. One of the areas had resolved into legitimate confusion, poorly organized records that appeared suspicious, but had innocent explanations traceable through the source documents. The second area was still open. It was the second area that was now keeping her awake at night, because the second area didn't look like Caldwell's work. The architecture was different. Sophisticated, less patient, but in some ways more dangerous, precisely because it was less careful. Where Caldwell had built a machine designed to run quietly for years, this second pattern had the quality of something done in a hurry. Opportunistic rather than premeditated. Someone who had seen an opening and moved through it quickly without worrying too much about how it would look later. She was still trying to establish who. The answer came to her, not through the accounts, but through a conversation she hadn't sought on a Friday afternoon when she stopped at the post office on her way home and found herself standing behind a man named Garrett Webb. Not her Garrett, a different one. A rancher's hand from the North Valley, who occasionally did business in town, who was talking to the postmaster in the easy, slightly too loud voice of a man who doesn't notice when his conversation has become public. "Holt's not worried," Webb was saying. "Told my boss himself. Says the Caldwell thing doesn't touch him because his name's not on any of the Walker accounts." "His name's not on the Walker accounts," the postmaster said. "Right," Webb said. "But his money was moving through them. Different channel. He says the girl, the Monroe woman, she only found what Caldwell did. She didn't find the rest of it." A pause. "He said that," the postmaster said. "Said it plain as anything," Webb said. "Over drinks on Tuesday. Said she's smart, but she looked where Walker pointed her, and nobody pointed her at the right place." Eliza stood completely still behind them. The line moved forward. Webb collected his mail and left without noticing her. She stepped up to the postmaster, collected the Monroe family post, said thank you, with a steady voice that gave nothing away, and walked out into the cold afternoon. She walked the distance to the ranch at a pace that would have told anyone who knew her that something had shifted. Garrett met her at the door with the particular alertness of a man who has learned over weeks that when Eliza Monroe arrives with that expression, something important is about to happen. "Is he in the workroom?" she said. "Study," Garrett said. "But I'll go in," she said. Thomas looked up when she opened the door. He read her face in the instant of looking. She could see it, the rapid assessment, the sharpening of attention. He set down what he was reading. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. Webb's conversation. Holt's claimed the specific phrase nobody pointed her at the right place. She told it without editorializing in the order. It had happened the way she always delivered information, because information delivered cleanly was more useful than information delivered dramatically, even when the information itself was dramatic. When she finished, Thomas was very still. "Holt," he said. "Holt," she said. "The second discrepancy in the accounts, the one I haven't been able to source. I think it's his." "He came to you," Thomas said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something quieter and more dangerous. He came to you at the ranch and asked about the scope of the investigation. He was establishing what I knew, she said, and apparently concluding that I hadn't found him. She paused. He was wrong. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You've been building it. For 3 weeks, she said. I didn't have enough to say anything confidently until now, but if Holt believes he's safe, he may have gotten careless. And careless men leave cleaner trails than careful ones. Thomas stood up. He moved to the window, not looking out. She knew by now, but thinking, using the physical displacement to organize what was happening in his mind. He had this habit, and she had learned to let it run its course. He is going to realize, Thomas said, that you're still looking. If he's talking about it at drinks, he's not as confident as he's performing. He's checking the perimeter. Yes, she said. Which means we have a limited window. He turned from the window. What do you need? 2 things, she said. Access to your land transaction records for the past 4 years, specifically any that involved Holt as a counterparty or intermediary. And a conversation with Fletcher before the end of next week. You'll have both by Monday, he said. She nodded and turned to go. She had her hand on the door when he said her name. She turned back. Are you all right? He said. The same question she had asked him returned now with the same genuine weight. He said things about you at that party, in front of people who repeated them, and now he's been using you as cover for his own theft. Thomas's voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it, not quite protectiveness, because he knew she didn't need that, but something adjacent to it. The anger of a man on behalf of someone he respects. I'm not all right about what he said, Eliza said honestly. But what I feel about it doesn't change what I need to do about it. And what I need to do is finish the documentation and give it to Fletcher, and let the law handle Bernard Holt the same way it's handling Daniel Caldwell. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said slowly, most people, when they've been wronged, want the person who wronged them to know who caught them. I know, she said. You don't want that. I want the record to be accurate, she said. That's sufficient. He shook his head, not in disagreement, but in the particular way of someone encountering a quality in another person that they find both admirable and slightly beyond their own reach. I'll have the land records ready Monday morning. The weekend passed in a way that had started to feel familiar. Her father stored during the daylight hours, the accounts after supper, the file growing at the kitchen table, while Harold Monroe read beside the lamp and didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He had become over the past weeks expert at this particular kind of companionship, present without pressing, aware without interrogating. She loved him for it in a way that felt very specific and very old. On Saturday evening, he looked up from his book and said, Thomas Walker came by the store today while you were at the post office. She looked up. What did he want? Dry goods, Harold said with a mildness that didn't quite conceal what was behind it. We talked for about 20 minutes. About you, her father said, and about the ranch, and about what he called the most valuable professional relationship he'd had in 16 years of operation. He turned a page. I thought you should know. She turned back to her file, but she sat with it for a long moment before she looked at it. Monday brought the land records, and the land records broke the case open. It was there, not hidden deeply, because Holt had not had the patience or the expertise to hide it the way Caldwell had. It was there in the gap between a land valuation Thomas had accepted in good faith 4 years ago and the actual assessed value of the parcel, a gap of $1,200 that had been managed through an intermediary account that Holt controlled but that bore a different name. $1,200 was not the sum that Caldwell had extracted over 6 years. But $1,200 taken in a single transaction from a man who trusted the intermediary was a crime with a paper trail, and the paper trail was now in Eliza's file. She brought it to Fletcher on Thursday. Fletcher read it in 15 minutes. He looked up at her over his reading glasses with an expression that had moved entirely out of the territory of almost surprise and into something that was straightforwardly professional respect. Miss Monroe, he said, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to consider it seriously. All right, she said. Have you considered studying law? She had not expected that. She let a beat pass before she said, "I've considered that the law requires practitioners to be male in this state at present." At present, Fletcher said with a precision that suggested he meant the qualifier. He looked back at the document. "This is solid. The valuation gap is documented, the intermediary account is traceable, and the connection to Holt is unambiguous. It won't produce the same scale of charges as the Caldwell case, but it will produce charges." He set the document down. "I'll add it to the January hearing." She walked back to the ranch with the afternoon light coming sideways and cold, and she told Thomas what Fletcher had said, and Thomas listened with the still complete attention he always brought to information that mattered. "Law," he said when she finished. Fletcher was making a point, she said, not a practical suggestion. "Maybe it should be practical," Thomas said. She looked at him. "The world changes," he said, slowly. "And it changes because specific people decide to push in specific directions." He paused. "You push harder than anyone I've met." "I do arithmetic," she said, which was what she always said when someone attributed to her something larger than she was comfortable claiming. "Stop doing that," he said. She was quiet. "Stop reducing what you do to the smallest possible description of it," he said. "You found 6 years of theft that 3 other men missed. You found a second theft that nobody was looking for. You built 2 legal cases that are going to hold up before a county judge. That is not arithmetic." She looked at him steadily. "What is it then?" "It's exactly what this valley needs more of," he said. And what Red Hollow has spent 26 years failing to notice was sitting in Harold Monroe's store. The day that everything almost came apart was a Tuesday in late November. She was alone in the workroom. Thomas had ridden out to the east pasture, a routine inspection that had become more frequent since Deaver's repositioning, when Garrett appeared in the doorway with the tight expression of a man managing urgency without showing it. "Man at the gate," Garrett said. "Says he works for Holt. Says he has a message for Miss Monroe directly." She set down her pen. "What kind of message?" "Wouldn't say," Garrett said. "But he's got 2 other men with him, and they're not dressed for social calls." She stood up. She thought clearly and quickly the way she thought when numbers required it, not fast in the sense of rushing, but with the particular velocity of a mind moving through variables without hesitation. Holt knew. Either through Webb's loose talk, reaching back to him, or through someone in Fletcher's office, or through the simple arithmetic of a guilty man, watching the people around the case, and noticing that Eliza Monroe was still working. He knew, and he had sent men to the ranch, and Thomas was 40 minutes out on the east pasture. "Send one of your men for Thomas," she said. "Fast." Garrett was already moving. "What do you want me to tell the men at the gate?" "Tell them Miss Monroe will be out in 5 minutes," she said. "And Garrett, stay where you can see me." She went to the gate. There were 3 of them, as Garrett had said, and she read them in the way she read a room, quickly looking for the pattern beneath the presentation. The one in front was doing the talking. The 2 behind him were doing the something else, the particular quality of men who are present not for conversation, but for the threat that presence represents. The one in front was young, which surprised her, younger than she expected for this errand, which meant either Holt was running out of options, or the older men had declined. He held out an envelope. Mr. Holt took the envelope. She did not open it. "Tell Mr. Holt I received it," she said. "He'd like a response," the man said. "He'll have one," she said, through the appropriate channel. She held the man's gaze with the stillness she had spent years building, the stillness that did not advertise itself as composure because it wasn't performing anything. It simply was. "Is there something else?" The man glanced at the 2 behind him. Some communication passed between them that she read as a calibration. They had expected something different from her. Uncertainty, perhaps. Retreat. The kind of response that confirms a threat is working. They were recalibrating. "Mr. Holt is a patient man," the young one said, trying to recover the ground he'd lost. "But he likes to know that his concerns have been heard." "His concerns have been received," she said. "Good afternoon." She turned and walked back to the house without hurrying, because hurrying would have told them something she had no intention of telling them. Behind her, she heard the sound of horses shifting and then moving away. Garrett was at the door. His expression asked a question without voicing it. "They're gone," she said. She held up the envelope. "Get me Thomas." She opened the envelope at the workroom table. The letter inside was 4 paragraphs, and it was she recognized immediately a threat dressed in the language of business. Holt expressed his concern that certain financial matters had been subject to misinterpretation. He noted that a more thorough examination of the records might produce questions about decisions that had been made with the best available information at the time. He suggested that a discussion between parties before matters proceeded further in a legal context might be mutually beneficial. He expressed his confidence that a woman of Eliza's intelligence would understand the wisdom of discretion. A woman of Eliza's intelligence. He had written it as flattery. It read as the specific contempt of a man who believes that reminding a woman of her intelligence will make her afraid of what his intelligence might do to her. She had read enough of Bernard Holt's actual intelligence in the land transaction records to know that his assessment of his own capabilities was, like most of his assessments, generous. She was still sitting with the letter when Thomas came through the door 20 minutes later, riding, cold and sharp-eyed Garrett, having reached him on the East Road. He read her face and then looked at the letter on the table. "He threatened you," Thomas said. It was not a question. "He made a business suggestion," she said, "with 3 men behind it." Thomas picked up the letter and read it. His face while he read did something she watched carefully. The control was absolute, the way a man controls himself when the alternative is an action he knows would be wrong. He set the letter down. "I'm going to," he started. "No," she said. He looked at her. "You're going to send that letter to Fletcher tonight," she said, "with a note describing the men at the gate and the time of their arrival. You're going to do that because a physical threat delivered to a witness in an active legal case is itself a crime, and it just gave Fletcher something he didn't have before, evidence that Holt is aware of his exposure and attempting to suppress testimony." She paused. "That letter just made the case against him stronger, Thomas. Don't waste it on anything else." He looked at her for a long time. "You," he said, "are extraordinary." She felt the word land, not as flattery. He didn't deliver it the way flattery is delivered, with the particular softness of someone expecting something in return. He delivered it the way he delivered all factual statements, directly and without ornamentation, as if it were simply a true thing that deserved to be said accurately. "I'm practical," she said. "You're extraordinary," he said again, with a firmness that declined to be redirected. Then, "I'm sending for Fletcher tonight. And tomorrow, Eliza, I want you to come to the ranch and stay. I'll arrange a room. I don't want you making that walk alone while Holt thinks he can send men places." She started to object. "I'm not?" He stopped and chose his words with the care she had come to recognize as his particular form of emotional precision. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to let me do the one thing I can actually do right now, which is make sure you're somewhere I can see." She held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved. The lamp held steady. "1 week," she said, "until the letter is with Fletcher and he's had time to respond." 1 week, he agreed. She stayed. The room Garrett prepared was plain and warm, practical in exactly the way she required, and Harold Monroe, informed by a Garrett-relayed message that evening, had sent back word of 2 sentences: "Good. Tell Thomas I said thank you." The days that followed had a quality she had not experienced before and had no ready language for. She worked in the mornings on the documentation. Thomas worked across the same table or in the adjacent room. They ate meals in the kitchen with Garrett, and occasionally with whichever hands happened to be in from the range, and the conversation at those meals was the ordinary conversation of people sharing a space that had accommodated them. Weather, cattle, the progress of the legal case, her father's health, the news from the county seat. Normal things said by people who were not in a normal situation, which had the odd effect of making the situation feel more normal than it had any right to feel. On the 4th evening, sitting across from each other after supper, with the table between them and no documents anywhere in sight. "For the first time in weeks," Thomas said, "my father built this ranch from 60 acres. She waited. "I was not a man who found things easy to say," Thomas continued. "He showed things, built things. When he was proud of something, he worked on it harder. When he cared about someone, he found them something useful to do and stood beside them while they did it. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I didn't understand that for a long time. I thought he was withholding himself. A pause. I understand it now. She looked at him across the table. What made you understand it? He looked back at her. The past 2 months, he said, simply, without the almost smile, without the careful dryness he used when directness felt dangerous. Just the plain statement of a true thing. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have arrived at a place together without quite having planned the route and are taking a moment to look around. Thomas, she said. I know, he said. The case isn't closed. The case isn't closed, she said. I know, he said. I'm not asking for anything. He set down the coffee cup. He stopped. Started again. I spent 8 years deciding that sufficiency was enough. Running the ranch well. Being a man nobody could fault. I had made a complete life out of the absence of wanting more. He looked at her steadily. I don't believe that anymore. And I want you to know I don't believe it because I'm not a man who says things he doesn't intend to follow with action. She was quiet for a long moment. I know you're not, she said. He nodded. He stood up, said night, with the natural ease of a man who has said what he came to say and has no need to elaborate, and left her at the table. She sat there for a while after he was gone. She thought about 26 years of a town's certainty about what she was and wasn't. She thought about the Hargrove party and the cold wall and the sound of a room that has decided you don't matter. She thought about Bernard Holt's letter and his men at the gate and the specific contempt of a man who mistakes composure for weakness. She thought about Fletcher reading 42 pages and asking if she'd considered the law. She thought about her father's 2-sentence message, good. Tell Thomas I said thank you. And she thought about a man who had spent 8 years deciding that a complete life could be built from the absence of wanting more, and who was telling her plainly, and without performance, that he had changed his mind. She picked up her coffee cup, found it had gone cold, and sat with it anyway. The case wasn't closed. But something else was opening, and she could feel it, the way you feel. Weather change, not with your eyes, but with something older and more reliable. Something that lives in the body and doesn't require proof to know what it knows. She set down the cold cup and went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without difficulty. Fletcher's response to the letter arrived in 4 days. It came not as a note, but as a formal legal document, a supplementary filing to the January hearing that incorporated Holt's letter as evidence of witness intimidation, added the testimony of Garrett and 2 ranch hands who had observed the men at the gate, and expanded the charges against Holt from financial fraud to include obstruction. Fletcher had written a single accompanying line to Thomas, "Your witness made this possible." Hold the line. Thomas read it at the breakfast table with Eliza across from him and Garrett refilling coffee at the stove, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely past the almost smile into something open and unambiguous. He called you my witness, Thomas said. I am your witness, she said. Among other things. Among other things, he agreed and picked up his coffee. Garrett at the stove said nothing. But his shoulders had a particular quality that suggested he was working very hard at the appearance of a man who is not listening. The week she had agreed to stay at the ranch became 10 days, and then 2 weeks by the natural extension of circumstances, rather than any explicit renegotiation. Her father's health had taken a turn in early December, not severe, not the crisis she had feared all autumn, but a fatigue that settled into his chest and required rest and warmth, and someone to manage the store. Thomas sent 2 of his hands to assist, without being asked, which Harold Monroe accepted with the dignity of a man who understands that accepting help graciously is its own form of strength. Eliza rode into town every second day to check the accounts and sit with her father for an hour and make sure the inventory was correct. On one of those visits, her father waited until she had finished reviewing the ledger and then said, without looking up from his own book, "He came again yesterday." "Thomas," she said. "Brought a ham," Harold said. "We talked for an hour." A pause. He's a man who knows how to sit with someone without filling all the silence, which is rarer than it should be. She set the ledger down. "Papa." "I'm not saying anything," Harold said with the mild precision of a man who is saying everything without saying it. "I'm just telling you he brought a ham." She went back to the ranch and did not mention the ham. But that evening when Thomas came in from the cold and sat down across from her with the ease that had become the natural texture of shared space, she looked at him and said, "You visited my father." "I did," he said. "Twice in the past week." "3 times," he said. She held his gaze. "Why?" He considered the question with the directness she had come to rely on as a fixed point in the world. "Because he's alone more than he should be, and he won't ask for company, and I know what it is to be alone in a house with too much room in it." He paused. "And because I like him." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them. The cold outside doing what December cold does in Colorado, pressing against every surface with genuine intention. "Thomas," she said. "The case isn't closed," he said, preempting her. "I know," she said. "I was going to say thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're welcome." The January hearing was set for the 9th. The days between Christmas and the hearing moved with a particular quality, compressed and significant, the way time moves when something is building toward resolution that will one way or another change the shape of what comes after. Red Hollow had not stopped watching. If anything, the watching had intensified as the hearing date approached, because Caldwell's arrest and Holt's documented intimidation attempt had transformed what had begun as interesting gossip into something the community understood was genuinely consequential. Bernard Holt had not left town. Eliza had half expected him to, but he had remained still attending church, still visible on the main street, still performing the confidence of a man who believes his position is recoverable. She watched him perform it and thought about the land records and the intermediary account and the $1,200, and felt nothing in particular about him, except the cool, specific satisfaction of knowing that the documentation was complete and accurate, and that there was nothing he could do about either of those facts. 2 days before the hearing, Ruth Calloway came to the ranch. She arrived at mid-morning, and Garrett showed her to the sitting room, rather than the workroom, which was Garrett's tactful assessment that this was personal rather than professional. Eliza came in from the workroom to find Ruth sitting very straight in the chair nearest the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression that had abandoned all its previous social architecture and become something closer to a person simply sitting in a room and not quite knowing what to do with herself. "Ruth," Eliza said. She sat down in the chair across from her. "I'm going to say something," Ruth said with the manner of a woman who has prepared this and intends to deliver it before her courage runs out. "And I want you to let me finish before you respond." "Go ahead," Eliza said. Ruth sat with whatever she was about to say for one more moment. Then, "I have not been kind to you. For years I have not been kind to you, and I told myself it was simply social honesty, that I was merely saying what everyone thought, and that there was a kind of integrity in saying it plainly. But that was not integrity. That was cruelty with a better name. And I knew the difference, and I chose the better name because it was more comfortable." She stopped. Her hands in her lap had tightened slightly. "What you have done here, the work you did, the way you did it without asking us to notice and without caring when we didn't. I have spent the past 2 months understanding that I was not looking at a woman who lacked things. I was looking at a woman I was afraid of without knowing I was afraid." The room was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Ruth continued with a steadiness that Eliza recognized as costing something. "I'm not entitled to that, and I won't put it on you as an obligation. I'm asking you to know that I understand what I said and what it cost you, and that I am ashamed of it." Eliza held Ruth Calloway's gaze for a long moment. Ruth did not look away, which took something. Eliza gave her credit for that. "Ruth," she said finally, "I stopped needing your apology about 6 weeks ago. Not because it doesn't matter, it does. But because what you thought of me stopped defining what I thought of myself. And once that happens, the apology is for you, not for me." Ruth absorbed that. Something in her expression shifted, not quite relief, but the specific movement of a woman receiving the truth she asked for and finding it despite everything clarifying. "That's yes," she said quietly. "I suppose it is." I accept it anyway, Eliza said. For what it's worth. Ruth left 20 minutes later, and Eliza stood at the window and watched her go and felt something settle in her chest that she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. Not forgiveness exactly, she had told Ruth the truth about that. But the release of something. The setting down of an old wariness that had been useful once and was no longer necessary. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind her. I heard some of that, he said. Not intentionally. I know, she said. She didn't turn around. She came to apologize. I know, he said. It was genuine, she said. Ruth Calloway is many things, but she doesn't perform genuine. When she's performing, you know it. He came to stand beside her at the window. They stood there for a moment, in the kind of silence that had become over months entirely natural, two people who had long since stopped needing to fill the space between them with sound. Eliza, he said. Thomas. The case closes in 2 days. Yes, she said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him. And what was between them in that moment had been building since October, and had survived 2 cases of fraud. A legal filing, a physical threat, a ham and more hours of shared table than either of them had counted, but both of them knew had been the real work of these months. Not the accounts, not the documentation, but the slow, careful, honest work of 2 people allowing themselves to be known. I told you I would ask again, he said. When the case was closed and the accounts were clean, I said I'd ask when neither of us was in the middle of something. You did, she said. I'm asking now, he said. Before the hearing, not after. Because I don't want you to think for one moment that what I'm asking has anything to do with what you built for me in those books. He held her gaze with the undeflectable steadiness of a man who has decided to say the true thing and is saying it. I'm asking because I have not in 16 years met a person I wanted beside me through what comes after. And I have spent every day of the past 3 months knowing I am looking at that person. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas, she said, I came to your ranch to look at your accounts. No, he said. I was not looking for this. Neither was I, he said. That seems relevant. She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her the way genuine responses sometimes do when you've been managing yourself carefully for a long time and something real breaks through the management. It does seem relevant, she said. He waited. He was a man who understood waiting, not the restless waiting of someone managing impatience, but the genuine waiting of someone who has planted something and understands that the outcome is not improved by reaching for it before it's ready. Yes, she said. One word. Plain and unadorned in the way of 2 people who have said enough words over enough months that they understand which ones carry the full weight. His expression did something she had not seen it do before. The control was still there. It was structural part of him. It would always be there, but something behind it eased visibly, like a man setting down a tension he had been holding without admitting he was holding it. Yes, he said back to her, as if confirming it by repetition. Don't make it a production, she said. He smiled. A real one, not the almost smile, not the precursor, but the actual thing which she discovered was worth every one of the almost smiles that had preceded it. I wouldn't dare, he said. The January 9th hearing lasted 4 hours. Eliza sat beside Fletcher at the county court, which was a room she had not previously been in, but which felt by the time she took her seat like a room she had been preparing for since October. Fletcher presented the primary case, the Caldwell theft, in the methodical, precise way of a man who understands that clarity is more persuasive than drama. He presented the secondary case, Holt's land fraud, with equal precision. He presented the intimidation evidence, the letter, the men at the gate, the witness statements from Garrett and the hands. Daniel Caldwell sat at one table with his own lawyer, who was a man from the county seat hired for the purpose of doing a job that the quality of the documentation had made considerably more difficult than it should have been. Caldwell's face across the room had the quality of a man who has been compressed by months of waiting into something harder and quieter than he had been before. He looked once at Eliza directly across the width of the courtroom. She met his gaze evenly and turned back to Fletcher's documents. Bernard Holt sat separately, his own lawyer beside him, and had adopted the expression of a man who has decided that dignity is the last available defense and is deploying it fully. He did not look at Eliza at all, which was itself a kind of information. Judge Harlan was a man of 60, with the face of someone who has listened to other people's disputes for long enough to have developed an extremely fine-tuned sensitivity to the difference between argument and truth. He read the document Fletcher submitted with the attention of someone who is genuinely reading, not performing reading. And when he asked questions, they were the questions of a man who has already understood the structure and wants to confirm specific load-bearing details. He asked Eliza 3 questions directly. She answered each of them in the way she answered everything clearly, without elaboration, beyond what was necessary, with the particular confidence of someone who is not performing knowledge, but simply reporting what she found. The 3rd question was, Miss Monroe, in your assessment, could the discrepancies you identified have been overlooked by a competent reviewer using standard accounting methods? She considered this carefully. A standard review beginning with the sale records, yes, she said. The discrepancies were specifically positioned to survive that approach. They were only visible from the tally records working in the opposite direction. And you approached it from the tally records? Yes, Your Honor. Why? Because the sale records had already been checked 3 times, she said. If the answer were there, it would have been found. The answer was somewhere else. Judge Harlan looked at her for a moment over his reading glasses. Logical, he said in the tone of a man who means it as a significant compliment and is delivering it with judicial understatement. The ruling came at the end of the 4 hours. Caldwell was bound over for trial on charges of theft by deception, falsification of business records, and breach of fiduciary trust. Holt was bound over on land fraud and obstruction. Sykes, who had provided a full statement in exchange for consideration, had his own separate accounting. Deaver had disappeared 2 weeks prior. No one in the room seemed surprised by this, and the judge noted it with the practiced neutrality of a man who has seen men run before and knows the court finds them eventually. Walking out of the courthouse into the cold January afternoon, Fletcher stopped beside Eliza on the steps and said quietly, and without his usual professional brevity, "You built that case, Miss Monroe. I presented it, but you built it." "You asked good questions," she said. "I always ask good questions," he said. "I don't always have good answers waiting for them." He put on his hat. "When Colorado changes its bar requirements, and it will within your lifetime, I hope you'll consider it seriously." She watched him go. Thomas was beside her, having said nothing during this exchange, which was his way of giving her the space to receive something without turning it into a shared moment before she'd had a chance to sit with it alone. "What did Fletcher say?" he asked after a moment. "He said I should consider law," she said. "Again," Thomas said. "Again," she said. "He's right," Thomas said. "For what that's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Coming from both of you." They walked to the horses. The county seat was 40 miles from Red Hollow, and they had ridden out together that morning in the cold, and would ride back in the cold, and she had not minded either direction of the journey in the way she sometimes minded solitary things. She was aware with a clarity that felt new, and also somehow old, like recognizing something she had known a long time, without having language for it, that she did not mind things the same way when he was beside her. They were 20 minutes out of the county seat, moving at an easy pace through the afternoon that had turned gray and still, with the particular quiet of winter, when Thomas said, "I want to ask you something." "You already asked me something," she said. "A different something," he said. She waited. "Your father's store," he said. "The accounts. He needs help. He's not going to ask for, and you've been carrying both the ranch work and the store work for months. I want to—" He paused. "I want to propose an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "I want to bring the store accounts under the ranch operation," he said. "Not a takeover, a partnership. Harold keeps the store, runs it as he sees fit. But the accounts are consolidated with the ranch accounts, which means a proper salary for the work you've been doing, and a stake in the operation that reflects what you've actually contributed." He held her gaze over the horses. "It's a practical proposal." "It's a very practical proposal," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. "You're proposing to bring my father's business into your operation," she said carefully. which means the Monroe family would be financially connected to the Walker Ranch. Yes, he said, which would look to Red Hollow like a very specific kind of commitment. It would, he said. She held his gaze. Thomas. Yes. Ask the question you're actually asking, she said. I was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. The cold air held still around them. And then Thomas Walker, a man who had built 16 years of a ranch on the principle that directness was more efficient than performance, looked at her across the winter afternoon and said, "Marry me, Eliza, not because you need what I have, and not because I need what you do, but because I have not once looked across a room or a table or 40 miles of open country and found the view better than when you're in it." She felt the words settle into her, the way true things settle not with drama, but with weight. The specific gravity of something real. That's not a small question, she said. No, he said. It's the largest one I have. She thought about October and the Hargrove party and the cold wall. She thought about 42 pages of documentation and a judge asking why she'd looked from the other direction. She thought about her father saying it's past time someone saw what I see, and Fletcher saying you built that case, and Ruth Calloway saying I was afraid without knowing I was afraid. She thought about a man who had visited her sick father 3 times in 1 week and brought a ham. Yes, she said. For the second time, and with more weight than the first, because the first had been a door opened, and this was a door walked through. Yes, Thomas. He nodded. He did not make a production of it because she had told him not to, and he was a man who honored what he was told. But something in the way he sat on that horse, in the way his shoulders held and his face turned briefly forward into the cold gray afternoon, told her that he was carrying the word, the way a man carries something he has wanted for longer than he admitted and has just been given. They rode back to Red Hollow in a silence that was the warmest thing Eliza Monroe had felt in years. Red Hollow found out about the engagement before either of them announced it, because Red Hollow always found out, and the way it found out was through Garrett, who told one person in what he apparently believed was confidence, and that person told 3 others, which was how information always worked in a town where everyone had known everyone else for 20 years. By the time Eliza and Thomas walked into the Monroe store together the following morning, Harold Monroe already knew. He looked up from behind the counter, looked at his daughter's face, looked at Thomas Walker standing beside her, with the settled air of a man who has arrived somewhere he intends to stay, and said with the economy of a man who has always understood which words matter, "Well, it's about time." Thomas extended his hand. Harold shook it, held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, and then released it, and turned to his daughter and opened his arms, and Eliza walked into them, the way she had since she was a child, the way she had on the hard days, and the good days, and the days that were simply days. And he held her, the way fathers hold daughters. They are proud of, and frightened for, and in love with, in the particular way that has no other name. "He's a good man," Harold said quietly into her hair. "I made sure of it before I told him about you." She pulled back. "You made sure of it." 3 conversations over 2 years, Harold said with the mild satisfaction of a man who has done something correctly and would like it acknowledged. "Before I said a word to him about your abilities, I had 3 conversations. I wanted to know who he was." She looked at her father, this small, worn, entirely clear-eyed man who had spent 2 years running a quiet investigation of his own into the character of Thomas Walker before directing Thomas Walker's attention toward his daughter, and felt something so large and so specific that she had no category for it except love, which was both too simple and exactly right. "Papa," she said. "You were never the wrong choice," Harold said. The world was just asking the wrong people. The news moved through Red Hollow with the particular velocity of something people had not expected, and then upon hearing it, immediately decided they had seen coming all along. This was the reliable social alchemy of small communities, the revision of memory that allows a town to absorb a surprise without having to admit it was surprised. People who had spent the autumn telling the second version of events now discovered they had always recognized something special in Eliza Monroe. People who had laughed at Bernard Holt's observation at the Hargrove party now found they couldn't quite recall being present for it. Eliza let them revise. She had no interest in holding people to their worst moments, not because those moments hadn't happened, but because the energy required to maintain a grievance against an entire town was energy that could be spent on better things. Catherine Briggs stopped her on the street 2 days after the news spread and said with genuine warmth and only a small trace of social calculation, "I always thought you'd do something remarkable, Eliza. I hope you know that." Eliza looked at her pleasantly. "I'll take that in the spirit intended," she said, which was the most honest response available. Thomas, for his part, handled Red Hollow's recalibration with the equanimity of a man who had been watching small towns perform their social adjustments for 41 years and had long since stopped expecting consistency. He attended the events that required attending, said the things that required saying, and was at every point so entirely himself, unhurried, direct, not performing his own authority, that the town's revision of its position on Eliza Monroe was paradoxically assisted by his complete refusal to make a statement about it. I didn't need to make a statement. He had made one in October, walking across a room to a woman everyone had decided didn't matter, and everything since had been the lived extension of that original statement. The wedding was set for March, which in Colorado was still winter, but was the first month that carried within it the reliable promise of spring. The planning fell to Eliza, assisted by Thomas's housekeeper and her father, and unexpectedly Ruth Calloway, who appeared one morning with specific organizational skills and the focused efficiency of a woman who understands that actions speak more legibly than apologies. "I can manage the arrangements for the reception," Ruth said at the Monroe kitchen table over coffee that Eliza had made, and poured in the full awareness that she was under no obligation to extend the invitation, and had done it anyway, which was its own kind of statement. "If you'll allow it." Eliza studied her. "Why?" "Because I'm good at it," Ruth said. "And because I owe you something useful." It was the right answer. Not the emotional answer, not the effusive answer, the practical, honest answer of a woman who had assessed the situation accurately and chosen the most appropriate form of amends. "All right," Eliza said. "I'll want final approval on everything." "Obviously," Ruth said in the tone of a woman who would not have it any other way either. 3 weeks before the wedding, Thomas came into the workroom. She had kept working through all of it on the ongoing accounts and the preparation for Caldwell's trial, which was scheduled for April, and on 2 new areas she had found in the land records that warranted review, and sat down across from her with an expression she had learned to read as the precursor to something important. "There's something I want to give you," he said. He set an envelope on the table. "Open it." She opened it. Inside was a document, a formal document drawn up by Fletcher, establishing the Monroe-Walker joint account management under both their names, formalizing the partnership structure he had proposed on the road home from the county seat. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the second page. She read it twice. "Thomas," she said. "It's a deed," he said, "to the eastern 40 acres. In your name alone, not the ranch's name, not joint yours." She looked at him. "Because I want you to have something that has nothing to do with what you do for the ranch and nothing to do with being my wife," he said. "Something that is simply yours because you have spent 26 years in this valley and you have earned ground here in every way that matters, and I want that to be true on paper as well." She held the document. 40 acres in her name, in the county record, in the permanent legal fact of the thing. "This is—" She stopped. She was not a woman who lost words easily. She had built her adult life on the precise deployment of words, on knowing exactly which ones to use and which to withhold. But something about this specific document, this piece of paper with her name on it, in Fletcher's careful legal hand, undid the precision temporarily. "This is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. It's practical," Thomas said, which was what she always said, returned to her with the slight warmth of an inside reference. "Stop that," she said. He smiled. The real one, which she still hadn't gotten used to and suspected she never would, which seemed right to her. Some things shouldn't become ordinary. "You deserve ground," he said. "You've always deserved ground. I'm just making it official." She set the document down and looked at him across the table, where they had spent months doing the work of 2 people who trusted each other and felt with absolute clarity. Something she had told herself for years was not available to her. Not because she had given up on it exactly, but because she had decided for self-protection to stop expecting it. She had been wrong to stop expecting it. She had been right to keep becoming the person who, when it arrived, was ready for it. "Thank you," she said, simply, which was sufficient. "You're welcome," he said, simply, which was also sufficient. The February air outside was the coldest it would be all winter, pressing against every wall, with the serious intention of a season that means what it says. But inside the workroom, with the lamp between them and the documents spread on the table, and March somewhere ahead of them on the other side of the cold inside, it was warm in the way that has nothing to do with the stove. She picked up her pen. He picked up his document. And the work continued as it always had, as it would the two of them side by side. Neither one asking the other to be less than they were. Neither one requiring the other to make themselves smaller, to fit a space that had always been the wrong size anyway. Outside Red Hollow went about its winter business, largely unaware that inside the Walker Ranch workroom, the woman it had spent years deciding was the wrong choice was sitting across from the man who had known from the moment he walked through a door that she was the only one, and that both of them, in the particular warmth of being accurately seen, had finally completely come home. March arrived the way it always did in Colorado. Not gently, not with the soft apology of a season that knows it's been awaited, but with the particular stubbornness of weather that hasn't finished with winter yet, and intends to make that clear. The morning of the wedding, the cold was still serious. The sky was the color of iron. Thomas Walker stood at the window of the room where he'd dressed and looked out at a world that showed no visible sign of celebration, and felt for the first time in years that the external conditions were entirely irrelevant to what was happening inside him. Garrett appeared in the doorway. He had the expression of a man who has known someone a long time and is experiencing quietly and without performance something close to joy on their behalf. "Church is full," he said. "I know," Thomas said. "Standing room," Garrett said. "People in the doorway." Thomas turned from the window. Red Hollow turning out to watch or turning out to celebrate? Garrett considered this with the honesty of a man who had observed Red Hollow for many years. Both, he said. "But I think by the end, it'll be mostly celebration. People want to be on the right side of a story when it becomes clear which side that is." Thomas put on his jacket. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's an accurate one," Garrett said. "There's a difference. The church held 60 people comfortably. It held 90 people that morning without comfort and without anyone leaving. Eliza had not wanted a large wedding, had said so plainly to Thomas in January in the workroom, with the same directness she brought to every position she held. "I don't need a performance," she had said. "I need it to be real." He had agreed with the ease of a man who had never wanted a performance either. But Red Hollow had its own momentum, and what the town wanted, it turned out, was the chance to be present at the thing. It had almost missed the event. It had nearly prevented by its own certainty that it would never happen. Harold Monroe walked his daughter down the aisle. He was not a well man. The winter had not been easy on him, and the effort of the morning showed in his face. But he walked the full distance with the deliberateness of someone who has decided that this particular action requires whatever it costs, and he would pay it without accounting. Eliza held his arm and felt his steadiness and matched it with her own, and the two of them moved through a room that had once, in various configurations, spent years deciding she wasn't worth the choosing. Thomas stood at the front and watched her come toward him with the focused, undeflectable attention he brought to everything that mattered, and when she reached him, he offered his hand, the way he had offered everything, directly, without ceremony, as a plain statement of intent. She took it. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony with the efficiency of a man who understands that the words matter less than the weight behind them, and the weight in that room was considerable. When it was finished, when the words had been said and acknowledged, Thomas looked at Eliza with an expression that the room would discuss for years afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so entirely unperformed. A man at the end of a long road, recognizing the place he'd arrived at and finding it exactly what he'd hoped for, and better than he'd deserved. "You're extraordinary," he said quietly enough that it was nearly private. "You keep saying that," she said. "I intend to keep saying it," he said, "until you stop deflecting it." "That may take some time," she said. "Good," he said. "I have time." The reception at the ranch afterward was Ruth Calloway's best work, which was saying something, because Ruth Calloway's worst work was still more organized than most people's best. The food was plentiful and well prepared. The space was arranged with the practical elegance of someone who understands that people need room to move and talk and find each other, and the warmth of the house against the cold outside created the specific atmosphere of a celebration that knows what it is celebrating. Thomas stayed at Eliza's side the entire evening, which people noticed, and which was itself a statement. Not the performance of attentiveness, not the studied closeness of a man, demonstrating to a room that he has made a good choice, but the natural proximity of someone who simply prefers to be where she is. He spoke to the people who came to him, answered the congratulations with the genuine courtesy that was characteristic of him, and was throughout the evening entirely himself, which was the most elegant thing he could have offered the occasion. Bernard Holt was not there. His trial was pending. His wife had moved to her sister's in Denver in February quietly without announcement. The chair he might have occupied in Red Hollow's social order had been filled so rapidly by the reality of his crimes that the space barely registered as empty. Daniel Caldwell's trial had been set for April. Sykes had taken his arrangement and left the county. Deaver had not been found, but Fletcher had assured Thomas that a man with paper this clean over him would surface eventually, and when he did, the documentation would be ready. The evening moved the way. Good evenings move with the loose, easy rhythm of people who are glad to be in the same room. Conversation that didn't need management. Laughter that arrived naturally and left room for quiet when quiet was appropriate. Harold Monroe sat in the warmest chair and held court in his understated way, receiving the people who came to him with the dignity of a man who has watched something he built very carefully finally stand up and prove its worth. Catherine Briggs sat with him for 20 minutes and came away with the expression of a woman who has been genuinely instructed by a conversation and is still processing it. She found Eliza later in the evening and said, "Your father told me something." "He tells people things," Eliza said. "He said you knew your own worth before anyone else did," Catherine said. "He said that was the most important thing, that you never let the town's assessment become your own." She paused. "He said he was prouder of that than anything." Eliza looked across the room at her father in his chair, holding a cup of tea. He was probably not supposed to have talking to old Tom Briggs, with the animation of a man who has earned the right to say exactly what he thinks. "He taught me that," she said. "He just doesn't remember that he did." The night ended slowly, the way good nights do. People leaving in ones and twos, with the reluctance of those who have been somewhere warm and are returning to the cold, not because they want to, but because the occasion has reached its natural close. Thomas stood at the door with Eliza and said good night to Red Hollow, and Red Hollow said good night to them, and the last person out was Ruth Calloway, who stopped in the doorway and looked at Eliza with an expression that had traveled a long way from October. "Eliza," she said. "Ruth," Eliza said. They looked at each other for a moment across the space of a winter evening and everything that had happened in the months between. Ruth nodded once, a small specific nod, the kind that carries the full weight of what can't be said adequately in words. Eliza nodded back, and Ruth went out into the cold, and the door closed, and the evening was finished. Thomas looked at Eliza. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. April brought the Caldwell trial, and the Caldwell trial brought something nobody in Red Hollow had fully anticipated the extent of it. Eliza sat in the county courthouse for 3 days, not as a principal witness this time, but as the person Fletcher consulted between sessions, the one who could look at a document produced by the defense and tell him within 5 minutes whether it was legitimate or manufactured, and where the manufacture was, if it was. She did this work in the corridor outside the courtroom on a bench, with documents spread across her knees, in the particular focused state of someone for whom a problem well solved is its own complete reward. Thomas was there for all 3 days. He didn't hover, that was not his nature, and he understood it was not what she needed. He sat nearby and worked on his own ranch correspondence and was available when she looked up, which was enough. On the second day, the defense produced a set of counter-documents that purported to show the cattle discrepancies as the result of administrative error rather than deliberate theft. Fletcher handed them to Eliza in the corridor, with 14 minutes before the afternoon session resumed. She read them in 11 minutes and told him exactly why they didn't hold the administrative error they claimed would have produced a consistent pattern of loss, and the pattern in the actual records was not consistent. It was calibrated, it varied precisely enough to stay below the threshold that would trigger a formal review. Administrative errors don't calibrate. People do. Fletcher took that into the courtroom, and Caldwell's defense spent the remaining session attempting to recover ground it had already lost. "How did you know?" Thomas asked her that evening on the ride back. "Administrative errors are random," she said. "Theft is deliberate. Deliberate things have internal logic. Once you know what you're looking for, the logic leaves a signature." He was quiet for a moment. "You find the signature." "Every time," she said. The verdict on Caldwell came on the third day, guilty on all primary counts. The sentence was handed down a week later, 4 years plus restitution calculated from Eliza's documentation, which the judge cited by name in the written order. Holt's trial followed in May. His conviction was narrower. The land fraud charge held the intimidation charge produced a fine rather than imprisonment, which Fletcher considered a partial result, and Eliza considered sufficient. The legal record existed. The financial penalty was real. Bernard Holt would carry the conviction for the rest of his life, in a county where it would follow him into every business interaction he attempted. She sat with the news of Holt's verdict at the kitchen table in the ranch house, her kitchen table now in her house now. A fact that still arrived with occasional surprise, despite being 3 months old, and felt the quiet finality of something completed. Not triumphant, not vindicated in the loud public way that some part of her had imagined in the cold months of October, when his words had found the tender places. Just finished. Clean. The record, accurate the truth, documented the law having done what it exists to do. Thomas came in from outside, still in his coat, and read her face. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she said. He sat down across from her. "How does that feel?" She considered the question honestly, the way she had learned from him, partly from the months of being around a man who asked genuine questions and waited for genuine answers to consider it. "Quieter than I expected," she said. "I thought I'd feel more. I thought when it finished there would be something larger." "What do you feel?" "Ready," she said. "Like I've been carrying something with both hands for a long time, and I've just set it down, and now I can use my hands for other things." He looked at her steadily. "Good," he said. "I have a long list of other things." She almost laughed. "I assumed you did." The summer came, and with it, the particular fullness of a working ranch in its best season, the movement of cattle, the management of land, the 100 ongoing negotiations between what a ranch needs and what the weather and the market and the land itself are prepared to offer. Eliza moved through all of it with the ease of someone who had been doing similar work in smaller scale for years and had simply expanded the scope, and with the additional dimension of having a partner who understood that the most useful thing he could do with someone capable was give them the room to be capable. He didn't supervise her work. He didn't explain the ranch to her as if she hadn't been learning it for months before they married. He consulted her on financial decisions, the way he would consult someone whose judgment he trusted, because he had verified it under pressure, which was the only kind of trust he gave and the most reliable kind to receive. She, in turn, brought to the partnership the specific thing she had always brought to every room she entered: precision, honesty, and the willingness to say the true thing when the true thing was inconvenient. She told him when she disagreed with his land strategy in the southeast quarter. She told him when the July cattle pricing was running below what the record suggested was achievable, and why. He received all of it with the equanimity of a man who has been waiting without knowing. He was waiting for someone who would tell him the truth, and who is not going to waste the experience by becoming defensive once that person has arrived. They argued twice that summer, real arguments, the kind that have edges and require work afterward. The first was about whether to extend a credit arrangement with a neighboring ranch that Eliza thought carried too much risk, and Thomas thought was a relationship obligation. The second was about the speed at which he wanted to expand the East Pasture operation, which she thought was outpacing their ability to document and manage the increased complexity without error. Both arguments ended the same way. Not with one of them surrendering, but with both of them working through the problem until they reached a position that was better than either of them had held going in. This was what they were. Eliza understood in the arguments as clearly as in the evenings and the work. Two people who had each spent a long time alone with their own thinking and had found in each other someone capable of genuinely improving it. Harold Monroe came to live at the ranch in August. The decision was made practically and without drama, because that was how decisions got made when both people making them were constitutionally opposed to drama. His health had continued its gradual decline through the summer, and the store was managed now by a competent young man Thomas had found in the county seat, who understood accounts and worked hard, and did not require Eliza to hold the operation together from a distance. The store was still Harold's. The partnership document was clear on that, but the management was delegated, and Harold himself was better situated closer to his daughter. He took the southeast room, which had the most light in the mornings, and installed himself in the household, with the ease of a man who has spent his life making himself useful in whatever space he occupies. He reviewed the store accounts twice a week. He advised Thomas on matters of local history when Thomas needed context for land questions that reached back before his own tenure in the valley. He sat with Eliza in the evenings when Thomas was in the field, and they talked about things that had no particular agenda book's history, the slow and interesting change of Red Hollow over the years of Harold's life in it. On a September evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the summer light coming through the window, Harold looked at his daughter and said, "You know what the best thing I ever did was?" "Told Thomas about me," she said. "No," he said. "That was the second best thing." He looked at her steadily. "The best thing was spending 26 years making sure that when someone finally saw you clearly, you already knew what they were seeing." She looked at her father, this small, worn, entirely clear-eyed man who had spent her childhood building in her deliberately and without announcement the specific architecture of a woman who could not be diminished by other people's failures of vision. "You planned it," she said. "All of it, from the beginning." "I raised you," he said. "There's a difference." He picked up his tea. The planning was just making sure the right person eventually looked in the right direction. She sat with that for a long time after he went to bed. The thing about Red Hollow she had learned over the years of living in it, and the years of being changed by what had happened within it, was that it was not a cruel town or a good town. It was a human town, which meant it contained within it both the capacity for the casual cruelty of people who mistake consensus for truth, and the capacity to correct itself when the evidence became impossible to argue with. This was not a satisfying quality. A town that was simply cruel would be easier to leave. A town that was capable of better and frequently settled for less required a different kind of navigation. Patience, clarity, the willingness to stay when staying was hard, and let your presence be its own argument. She had stayed. She had let her presence be its own argument. And Red Hollow over the months since October had revised itself in the way human communities always revise themselves imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely in the ways that count. The younger women of the town had noticed with the sharp attention of people who are still figuring out what's possible that Eliza Monroe had not been chosen because she had made herself smaller or more palatable or more easily categorized. She had been chosen because she had refused to do any of those things, and someone with eyes clear enough to see past the town's comfortable consensus had looked at what she actually was and found it exactly what he needed. This was not a lesson Red Hollow had intended to teach. It was the lesson it had taught anyway by being wrong about her so loudly and for so long. Fletcher wrote in November. He was reaching out to a colleague in Denver who was working with the territorial legislature on a proposal regarding professional licensing reforms that, if they passed, would begin the process of opening bar admission to women. He wanted to know the letter said whether Miss Monroe, Mrs. Walker, he corrected himself in parentheses, would be willing to speak to that colleague about her experience with legal documentation and evidentiary preparation. She read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Thomas without comment. He read it. He looked up. "What do you want to do?" "I want to write back and say yes," she said. Then write back and say yes, he said. He passed the letter back to her. I'll have Garrett arrange the trip to Denver when you're ready. You're not going to say anything about it, she said. What would I say? He said. Some men would say things, she said, about their wives traveling to Denver to speak to legislators. Some men. He agreed with the specific dryness that was his most characteristic form of humor, would be those men. He picked up his document. I'm not. She wrote to Fletcher that afternoon. She wrote with the clarity and economy that had always been her native language, saying yes to the conversation, and yes to Denver, and yes to the idea that the work she had done deserved to be part of a larger argument about what women were capable of when given the room to be capable. She sealed the letter and gave it to Garrett for the Morning Post, and felt doing so that she was dropping a stone into water and watching the rings move outward in directions she couldn't yet see. Thomas found her at the table after supper, still thinking, which he recognized as a specific state, requiring no intervention, but available for conversation if she wanted it. He sat down. What are you thinking about? He said. Fletcher's letter, she said. And what comes after it? She paused. I keep thinking about something he said in January at the courthouse. He said the world changes slowly, and it changes because specific people decide to push in specific directions. I said that, Thomas said. She looked at him. You did, she said. Fletcher quoted you. He was quiet for a moment. I was talking about you, he said. I know, she said. The winter came again, the second winter, and it came with the particular authority of a season that has been before and knows the territory. The ranch settled into its cold weather rhythms, the indoor work, the account reviews, the correspondence with Fletcher about the Denver meeting, and with the store manager, about the January inventory, the evenings with Harold and the mornings with Thomas, and the work that ran through all of it, like a current steady and present and entirely her own. One evening in December, Thomas came home from a long day in the South Field and found Eliza at the desk in the study writing. She had developed the habit of writing in the evenings, not accounts, not documentation, but something else, something longer and more considered that she had not yet described to him in any specific terms. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, working her pen, moving across the page. Her posture, the particular upright focus of complete concentration, and felt the thing he had felt on the road from the county seat in January of the previous year, the thing that had sent him across the floor of the Hargrove house in October of the year before, that the specific recognition of a person who is exactly what the world needs more of, sitting in front of him, entirely real. What are you writing? He said. She looked up. She considered him for a moment. Something for the Denver meeting, she said. Fletcher's colleague wants a written account of the Monroe Walker case for the legislative proposal, an account of what was done, and how and what it demonstrates about capability and training and access to professional practice. A legal brief, he said. Fletcher's word, she said. I'm calling it an account. He came into the room and sat across from her. Can I read it when it's done? Yes, she said. I want you to read it before I send it. You were half the case. Less than half, he said. That's not accurate, she said. You trusted me with the access, the records, and the time. You held the line when Holt sent men to the gate. You rode to the county seat yourself twice. You are not a minor character in this. He looked at her steadily. Neither are you, he said, in any version of this story. She looked back at him. I know, she said. And the thing about the way she said it quietly, without deflection, without the small retreat she had spent years making when something threatened to confirm that she might actually be what she hoped she was that she meant it, completely, without reservation or apology. She had arrived there, to the place her father had spent 26 years building toward. The place that Thomas Walker had crossed a room to find and found and chosen. The place that Red Hollow had failed to see, and then failed to deny, and then in the end been changed by. She had arrived at the exact, accurate, unambiguous knowledge of her own worth. It had taken the better part of a life to get there. It had required a man wise enough to look from the right direction, a father stubborn enough to build what couldn't be bought, a town wrong enough to prove the lesson by failing to learn it faster, and a woman who had refused through every version of being dismissed, overlooked, reduced, and underestimated to let anyone else's blindness become her own. Thomas Walker reached across the desk and took her hand. She let him and held his hand, and they sat together in the lamplight of a December evening, with the cold doing what the cold does outside, and the work spread between them and the ranch around them, and the future somewhere ahead, real and open and entirely theirs. The woman nobody wanted had become the only one worth choosing. Not because the world had finally gotten wise enough to recognize her, but because she had never, not once, not for a single defeated moment, stopped being exactly who she was. And the right man, when he walked through the right door at the right moment, had simply had the clarity to look at the truth. Everyone else had been standing in front of and refusing to see. That was the whole of it. That was everything.